Well, I don't think I could have ever done Look Back in Anger without Roots. There needs to be a tonic to that play.
One of the things that these plays did was set a template for how British theatre has worked ever since.
When it played, I think it blew the roof off.
Theatre was packed every night. It was the most extraordinary feeling. I haven't had it again.
I think an actor's role is often to display some very difficult parts of our humanity.
It was a cry of anger and frustration about what was going on around us.
I think what I wanted to explore fundamentally is, what was I angry about now?
So things that make me angry are not being respected.
Just inequality and injustice.
The fact houses don't cost pennies anymore.
Young people have to fight against a battle that I don't think many generations before have.
Anger doesn't have to be violent, but anger can just be galvanising.
Why do I spend 9 months on yes?
Where does the anger come from? I mean, that was one of the sort of massive questions we were trying to answer in the rehearsal room all the time. What is Jimmy Porter so bloody angry about? So the story of Look Back in Anger is Jimmy Porter, who lives in this cramped little flat with his wife, Alison, who comes from a much more upper-class background than him. They've been living in boredom. Every Sunday evening seems to play out the same, and feeling very frustrated. And Jimmy sort of targets his frustration and his vitriol towards his wife.
Both Look Back in Anger and Roots are deeply autobiographical plays. Quite clearly, Look Back in Anger is based on Osborne's own experience as a young actor. Roots is based on Arnold Wesker's wife.
Roots is about a family, and it's about a young woman called Beatty Bryant returning to her rural family farm in Norfolk after having met in London a firebrand socialist activist called Ronnie.
Her eyes have been opened to kind of loads of things that she's never questioned or thought about.
And some of these ideas are not very welcome in her family home.
I don't care.
It's a very political play. It takes those big political ideas and sort of regurgitates them into the relationships within this family. And so it has a really universal quality, I think, because we can all recognise ourselves in this family unit on stage.
I've got something to say and I'm going to say it, and I don't care if you don't like being told things.
At the time, these plays certainly are trying to capture a generation that was, in a sense, slightly orphaned, felt very cut adrift from the mainstream of culture, had no access to power.
Well, I was 16 when Look Back in Anger opened in London. It seemed to be the play that was for us, for speaking to people of my age, and that was frustrated with English life in the 1950s. That's the nub of it.
The war had changed so much in British culture. Politically, it had been the inspiration for developing a welfare state, for an idea that government's role should be to support and help people, to educate people, to keep people healthy. Look Back in Anger, on one level, is part of that process because it premiered at the Royal Court, and the Royal Court was the first major theatre to have state subsidy, an art theatre, something that would do serious plays, that would be a bit challenging, that might be formally quite experimental, wouldn't necessarily fill a West End theatre for months and months and months, but nonetheless would attract a certain audience, and Arts Council money would be able to support that.
British theatre around that time, mid-1950s, was escapist, elegant, restrained emotionally.
Theatre audiences weren't used to seeing working class characters on stage. What they were used to was middle class drawing room dramas that had a politeness to them, and there was an impoliteness in the way that Wesker and Osborne very truthfully reflected all the ups and downs of real life.
It was a play that admitted to the murky, ugly nature of private life.
That was the extraordinary thing about it, the anger that on the pouring out, and which Osborne was remarkable at. If you read any of his books or any of his other plays, he has this ability to turn phrases that actually bite.
Behold, the Lady Pusillanimous. Hi, Pusey! When's your next picture?
We've all seen the shows, and I was just wondering if we could talk about what you thought of them.
I found the prospect quite intriguing, and I think we're quite familiar with being angry and young.
I think why Look Back in Anger and Roots was such a moment was this was the first time we'd seen people from this class and these stories told. It was, I think, the first time representation had looked and felt like that.
Watching these plays can be a bit of a lens onto how discussions have kind of moved on things like inequality. I think at the time there will have been so many women in the audience who identified with the women on stage in Look Back in Anger, but maybe couldn't stand up and say, this is misogyny or this is abuse. Now we get to look back on it and be like, actually, things are changing, and one of the ways that things have changed is we get to speak truth into that power. We get to name things.
If only something would happen to you and wake you out of your beauty sleep. If you could have a child and it would die.
It requires me to go to a place emotionally and psychologically that's, that is about understanding, facets of my own humanity, and that's, it's a deeply, sometimes uncomfortable process, but I would argue is a prerequisite for the job.
It's hard to be in it for such a long time and sort of ask yourself to have your own politics meet the politics of what this play is trying to present.
I think you revive a restoration play. It's interesting to see, but it's a distance. It's another time.
I think there are ways in which you could also use this as a kind of a warning story. It's the thing you kind of don't want to do. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that.
Do that again, you Welsh ruffian, and I'll pull your ears off.
Jimmy Porter is unfiltered, and he says the nastiest things when you really just want to hurt the person you love.
Well, why not have her in here? Did you tell her to bring her armour? Because she's going to need it.
Why don't you shut up? Please.
Oh, my dear wife, you have got so much to learn.
And we see how that complicated, horrible, masculine mess of a personality works, which is why I'm very hesitant to say that this play is just misogynistic. I think it shows us misogyny in a really interesting way.
The idea of things are shitty and then you unleash your shitty on everything else. I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. And then but how far does it go? What is the line that you must draw when you think the world has been bad to you and now you're being bad to everyone else?
Oh, you think the world's treated you pretty badly, don't you?
Don't try and take his suffering away from him. He'd be lost without it.
And that is what he say socialism is. Christ, he say socialism isn't talking all the time. It's living.
Roots talks a lot about apathy and what we turn away from, what we are afraid to have conversations about, or what we avoid having conversations about because they feel too difficult. And I feel like that conversation is really important now.
It's dancing. It's being interested in what's going on around you. It's being concerned about people and the world. And
I heard Ethel Cain saying recently that we're in an irony epidemic, and there's something so sincere about Roots that really resonated with me, because there's a fear of being not taken seriously if you're kind of full of hope and sincerity. And I loved that was being explored in Roots.
perfect. Don't it make you want to dance?
Do you want to go back to you thinking Roots was kind of a bit more modern, or?
Yeah, it felt like it was a modern kind of telling. If I didn't know that it was an old piece, I could mistake it for a new writing piece that could be on at the Almeida.
I was conscious that it was a play that came from the 1950s. And I've been really struck by how many people now watching it have talked about how relevant it feels to this moment.
I think what's quite fascinating about Roots is that it seems to be about truths that kind of remain.
I was just going to say, in terms of it resonating. We kind of left Roots, and forgive me if I'm putting words in people's mouths, but I feel like we all sort of said like, oh God, that really reminds me of me. Oh, I can completely see myself in BT, like not trying to attack your family, but like taking people on and share these like new ideas that you've like heard about and transcend beyond her family roots.
We're in a time where Gen Z and younger are on the front line of conveying their point of view, trying to get their point of view out there through social media. And I think BT feels very current in that way. So even though the play is very much of its time, the things it discusses and the way it discusses them feels very resonant to now.
I think there are some really interesting parallels with now, because one of the things that slightly horrifies me, for example, is I teach at university. I am very, very conscious that my students are probably the first generation who will have a worse deal than their parents. I think young people have been slightly abandoned and forgotten and taken for granted. That is something that these plays can really articulate and they can really speak to.
How did you first feel when you heard that the Almeida was programming Roots and Look Back in Anger in repertory?
When they said they were doing rep, I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because it doesn't happen anymore, unless you're at like a drama school that does rep, which is still quite rare.
It felt like a gamble, and it felt like doing something different and a bit of a risk. So I was really, really excited to see kind of what the plays turned out to be and how they spoke to each other.
It's a really intense injection of the drama of that period, and I think they complement each other very well. Obviously, you have a very, very driven leading male protagonist in Look Back in Anger, and similarly a very driven female protagonist in Roots, which I think make for a very exciting contrast.
One of the big challenges of the rep was making sure the actors could easily transfer between plays. I think that was quite difficult at the start because they're very different worlds.
Well, I don't think I could have ever done Look Back in Anger without Roots. There needs to be a tonic to that play.
I suppose as an actor, I quite enjoy an intensity to sort of living and breathing something. And inevitably with a rep, it comes with its breaks because you're on to the next show, which has a very different feel, and I'm playing somebody completely different.
It's an opportunity to play, you know, something wildly different, and just, I mean, the whole process was entirely different. You know, Diyan's approach to the play was very different. It had a very different feeling.
It is so rich being able to play two characters, but also having different perspectives of two writers, and therefore then all the other characters within the play. It's just been really fulfilling. And I also think that these plays together create so much more conversation as well.
And I think the thing that was difficult as well was that we were living with this text for a very long time. Because the actors were rehearsing in rep, it was 3 months from the first day of rehearsal to press night. And that is a much longer cycle than we are used to in the British theatre system, at least, where you might be spending 6 weeks from beginning of rehearsal to opening night.
The thing that really struck me when I saw them is that they're in repertory. They have the same set. And that is how the Royal Court started in 1956. They had a permanent set. They did everything in repertory.
Do you know that they made the theatre alive, made the Royal Court alive?
And that, again, was partly about saying there's an artistic continuity. So you're going to notice there is an affinity between these plays, but also it allows you to kind of see the kind of ghosts of the other characters appearing on stage, which gives you, again, this broader sense of a generational project, which I think is going on in these plays. It's about saying there's a generation here that you have not heard before, and boy, are you going to hear it now.
These plays teach us that plays become vibrant and interesting when about the world in which we live.
It created the possibility. Lots of writers, seeing how well it had done, began writing about people they knew, like Wesker, like the play you've got on.
And I think we're in an era where people are writing quite autobiographically. They are speaking their truth. What I think lots of writers could learn from these plays is how to place that personal very intensely revealing confessional, almost, dramaturgy within a broader landscape that kind of connects to a wider sense of experience.
And if you can relate your own predicament to the society's problems and dilemmas, then you're a real playwright.
I went to a march recently and there were this group of students, presumably from London universities, who were so angry and so passionate and sort of chanting at the top of their lungs and so energetically. And I was like, yes, they're angry, but they are hopeful as well. And they have hope. I don't think the anger in Look Back and Anger necessarily is that sort of positive anger, but I do think anger is a generative force. And I do think if we are angry about injustice, if we are angry about the treatment of the less fortunate in society, whether that's at home or whether that's abroad, then if enough people are angry, then there can be a real momentum to try and make things better.
And I asked Dusty Wesker, who's Arnold Wesker's wife, why Roots was so powerful when it first opened. And she said it was a really terrible time. She said the newspapers every day were just printing so much sort of fear-mongering and the country felt so divided between people who wanted change and people who wanted to hold on to the old way. It was the hope that people didn't even realise they needed. And I asked her, what do you think about now? And she said, oh, it's so much worse now. It's so much worse, and we need that hope more than ever. And Roots has a very hopeful ending.
I can feel it's happening. No, I can feel it's happened. I'm beginning on my own 2 feet. I'm beginning.
I think I feel most hopeful when young people becoming political and learning how to challenge, questioning things.
What gives me hope is how intense and unique Gen Z are in their protesting and how they stand for things, they don't back down.
Something that I don't think many people would think about, which is actually social media, makes me kind of hopeful. Or internet, or I have so much access to things that I wouldn't have had in previous generations.
I think I draw a lot of sometimes hope from knowing no matter how things feel, I'm not the first person in this situation.
I think some things that make me hopeful are that feeling that people are innately good and loving, and the future is open-ended. It's not a fixed thing. And in that way, hope is something we can derive from that as well.